Are larger numbers of young athletes who should be the fittest amongst us inexplicably dropping dead? And if so, is there any chance that it's to do with COVID vaccines? Let's have a look. Recently, I got this request. Hi Mallen, I know we're all trying to move on from COVID, but I still want to know what's true in the spirit of your excellent channel. Ah, flattery, flattery. I've had several people drawing my attention to Pierre Kory's claims that the vaccine has been causing lots of harm to people that isn't being admitted, and particularly that across the world, vaccinated athletes have been dropping dead for no apparent cause. I wondered if you could have a look at this. Pierre Kory, of course, is one of those that has been actively campaigning on behalf of ivermectin over the last couple of years, a topic that I've covered a number of times. I'd noticed a few claims about young athletes dying at the start of the year. I've seen so many such claims that fall apart as soon as you look at them. I didn't really pay that much attention. I just rather assumed then that it all kind of went away on its own accord, as these things often do. But if it's still being discussed, maybe there's more to it. So I had a quick look, an interview with Pierre Kory on Rumble, talking about vax deaths and injuries is an ignored humanitarian catastrophe. Let me reiterate two things before we go further. Firstly, I have no stake in which way this goes. I am not ideologically for or against any particular medical procedures. If I stake my identity on anything, it's having an open mind and looking to the evidence. So I'm not pro-vaccine, I'm not anti-vaccine, I'm pro-truth. I look at what the US is doing now, rolling out COVID vaccinations for toddlers. Doesn't seem to make a huge amount of sense from what we know about the data. I think there's plenty to be sceptical about. There are hard questions to be asked about some of the dubious public policy choices in this area. That said, there's a lot of nonsense that gets bandied about on the other side in the cause of critique as well. I apply the same process to any claim from whichever direction. What is the claim? What evidence is quoted in support of it? Is the evidence actually quoted accurately? Is there contrary evidence? Is there debate amongst the experts? And from all of that, then, what can we conclude? And I also entirely accept that sometimes I have to conclude I'm not qualified to judge if the scientific debates get specialised and complex. I'd rather call I don't know and can only continue to watch with interest than pretend I know something that I don't. Now, that doesn't happen very often because usually the points of dispute are possible to explain and understand for all of us. But, just sometimes you have to be humble enough to recognise when it's not. That's it. People ask me to look into things, but really anyone can apply the same methodology that I use to any question in front of them. I invite you to do so. So that was the first thing I wanted to reiterate. The second is my standard disclaimer in dealing with these specific topics. You know how it goes. I am a YouTuber, not a doctor. Do not get your medical advice from YouTubers. Get it from your own doctor. Nothing in this video constitutes medical advice. Choosing to take or not to take any medication has to be your decision based on your very personal own risk profile. And I would add generally the actual advice I would give, never ever make critical medical decisions based on a consensus thinking of your identity group. Medical science doesn't care about your politics. All right. So the specific question was about athletes dropping dead. My questioner gave me a link to this video on Rumble with this exchange.
So you think the big uptick in sudden death is clearly the vaccines?
I am not confused about it at all. Just look at the professional football players. I just did a review of this. There's a website that has cataloged all of the professional football players. Right now, 1,024 collapses on the field with something like 780 deaths of young, healthy footballers and other athletes from around the world in 2021. Do you know what
football or soccer?
Yeah, that's football or soccer. Exactly. Sorry,
soccer.
I always forget, what
All right.
to say.
Yeah. So
I love soccer/football. And so
football to you, soccer. So 1,000 soccer players that fall down.
Over 1,000, and it's not all soccer. There have been others from other sports, but they're predominantly soccer. However, they've done reviews of sudden death in young, healthy athletes. Over 30 years, you know what the average was in 1 year? 29 across the world. We already are over 1,000 in the last year. And just in January of this year, there was 127 collapses and 87 deaths in 1 month, January.
A specific claim with some very specific numbers and a reference to a website source, which after some looking around led to this website here, goodsciencing.com. Real science, with the slogan, "Science needs open discussion, anything else is totalitarian." Slightly overstated, but fine. Real science is a good rallying cry. Let's see what backs it up. This article is what Kory was referencing. It's a rolling total and regularly updated. At the point of me looking at it, it said this: 1,111 athlete cardiac arrests, serious issues, 732 dead after COVID injection. Sounds highly persuasive, but bear in mind that if a large proportion of your population gets vaccinated, you could create all sorts of similar headlines, like 2,000, number made up, 2,000 people involved in car accidents after COVID injection. Well, obviously in that case, the fact they'd had COVID injections would be irrelevant to the fact they were in car accidents. But, you know, if lots of people get vaccinated, then lots of things are going to happen to them after vaccination, just as things were happening to them before vaccination. So we need some evidence that what is being described is unusual and that there's a causal link as to why it's suddenly surged unusually. And from what Kory said, sounds like there has indeed been a huge change taking place. First, let's take a quick look at this website that's being quoted as a source, because I've not come across it before. It would be good to know what sort of credentials it has. The homepage is full of lively expositions on various related and not that related themes, including ivermectin, global warming, science is not science, okay, masks, Neil Oliver notices world leaders reading from the same script. So this isn't exactly a hard sciences website. Who's behind it? I had a look at the About page. A few people have been asking who we are, what our credentials are, and what we're trying to prove. We are a small team of investigators, news editors, journalists and truth seekers, now backed up by others who are discovering pieces of information that we can investigate. It doesn't really matter who we are. Well, it kinda does. Actually, declaring conflicts of interest and, you know, all that boring stuff. This is reminiscent of the ivermectin meta-study website, ivmmeta.com, similarly anonymous, claims to have been set up by retired concerned doctors, even though it had excellent web design and anonymity from the start, was announced to the world by multiple Twitter bots, not congruent with that claimed ownership. Anyway, this one goes on to say this: we're doing this anonymously because we've seen people viciously attacked and threatened for doing things like this, so we're not going to open ourselves or any of our contacts to that. Also, please note, we're not being paid, we're not making any money from this, it is costing us time, effort and money. And we're supposed to take your word for that. Why? We're doing it because of a concerted effort to block this information. But as some smart people used to say, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Wait, sunlight is the best disinfectant, says the people who are anonymous and by definition hiding in the shadows. Okay. I've learned from conversations about ivmmeta.com that if people support a position, they become determinedly incurious about the identity of the people who run websites promoting that thing. My general principle is if they're not prepared to say who they are, you take a few points off the credence that you might otherwise have given them. But that said, let's look at what they say and what supports it. So here's one of those claims that were made by Pierre Kory. The International Olympic Committee in Lausanne, Switzerland, studied documents from international databanks from 1966 to 2004. Those documents indicate 1,101 sudden deaths in athletes under 35 years of age, an average of 29 athletes per year, the sports with the highest incidence being soccer and basketball. And it provides a link to this report in the NIH National Library of Medicine, Sudden Cardiac Death in Athletes, the Lausanne Recommendations from 2006. For background, that paper says this: the sudden death of athletes under 35 years engaged in competitive sports is a well-known occurrence. The incidence is higher in athletes, approximately 2 out of 100,000 per year, than in non-athletes, 2.5 to 1. And the cause is cardiovascular in over 90%. Now, I didn't know that. Like many of you, I suspect I would have assumed that the young athletes were the healthiest people on the planet, so you would get fewer incidences, not more. But there you go. So why does that happen? Well, it says this: SCD occurs more frequently in young athletes, even those under the age of 18 years, than expected, and is predominantly caused by pre-existing congenital cardiac abnormalities. So individuals have abnormalities that wouldn't show up, I guess, except that they're pushing their body to the extreme with high-intensity sport, and that tragically brings those anomalies into play, which, now you say it, makes sense. The study conducted a systematic review of literature. Sudden cardiac death, SCD, occurred in 1101, 1966 to 2004, reported cases in athletes under 35 years. 50% had congenital anatomical heart disease and cardiomyopathies, and 10% had early onset atherosclerotic heart disease. 40% occurred in athletes under 18 years, 33% under 16 years. The female to male ratio was 1 to 9. SCD was reported in almost all sports. Most frequently involved were soccer, 30%, basketball 25%, and running 15%. So that's where the 29 per year figure comes from. 1,100 cases in the 38 years between 1966 and 2004. Specifically about sudden cardiac death, athletes under 35 years, fine. But the study doesn't set out to identify the total incidence of such deaths. It reviews a number of studies looking at causes. So that's presumably why it's quite a low figure. And you would say, as a result, it should not be quoted as a source for a total number, because that's not what it was studying. The Sciencing website also references another paper by Maron et al. And says that it suggests 66 deaths per year. Now, it doesn't provide a link, but a quick search and we find it. Sudden deaths in young competitive athletes, analysis of 1,866 deaths in the United States, 1980 to 2006. So this study is specific to the United States and for competitive athletes generally. And it found 1,866 deaths in 27 years, which is 69 per year, which is not so far off the 66 quoted on the website. But that's just for the US, not worldwide. It also says that it only included deaths that had no other clinical cause, and only for athletes under the age of 40 who were actively engaged in competitive sports. And it broke it down like this. Sudden deaths were predominantly due to cardiovascular disease, 1,049, 56%, but causes also included blunt trauma that caused structural damage, 416, 22%, commotio cordis, 65, 3%, and heat stroke, 46, 2%. Are there any other figures for sudden deaths amongst athletes more broadly? I go to Google Scholar, start typing in sudden deaths, athletes, and you can see it already suggests sudden deaths cardiac as a common search. And we come across a number of papers. From the top results, the most recent is a paper from The Lancet by Corrado and Zorzi 2017, cited by 222 other researchers, unfortunately not available without subscription. Let's try again, specifically on sudden death in footballers, which Pierre Kory mentioned, and we come up with this study from the British Journal of Sports Medicine. FIFA Sudden Death Registry, FIFA-SDR, a prospective observational study of sudden death in worldwide football from 2014 to 2018. Okay, so a wider definition, sudden death, not just cardiac death, which is what Kory was talking about. And this one specifically football. So we would expect the numbers to be smaller than the one on the website that Kory was quoting, but then it has no age limits and that would push it back up a bit. The findings of his paper were this: a total of 617 players, mean age 34 years, 96% men, with sudden death were reported from 67 countries, 142 players, 23% survived. A diagnosis by autopsy or definite medical reports was established in 211 cases, 34%. The leading cause in players over the age of 35 years was coronary artery disease, 76%, and in players under 35 years was sudden unexplained death, SUD, 22%. I love the fact they've given an acronym suggesting a syndrome for the majority under 35, sudden unexplained death, which is just an acronym for, dunno mate, DNM. It also goes into a bit more detail. In players under 35 years, the leading cause of SCD varied by region. Cardiomyopathy in South America, 42%. Coronary artery anomaly in North America, 33%. And SUD, or DNM, in Europe, 26%. I note that 617 players over a 4-year period is a considerably large number, more than 150 per year, than 29 per year. And that's just for football, soccer players. So even with the wider age range, something seems askew with that baseline. But let's look deeper. The site lists the detail of all the deaths that it includes in its overall figures. And it introduces them like this: it is definitely not normal for so many mainly young athletes to suffer from cardiac arrest or to die while playing their sport. But this year, it is happening. Well, actually, as we've seen, it is normal for a higher percentage of young people who are high-level athletes to suffer from sudden cardiac death than other young people, a 2.5 to 1 ratio. But for sure, the headline numbers they're giving here are a lot higher than those historical precedents, so let's not be so picky. He then goes on to say this: many of these heart issues and deaths come shortly after they got a COVID vaccine. While it's possible this can happen to people who did not get a COVID vaccine, the sheer numbers clearly point to the only obvious cause. That is not a good scientific proposition at all. I mean, for one thing, many of those people may well have had COVID. So I trust the data is going to include some medical indicator that there was a link to vaccination and not to another factor. Because otherwise, really, you've got nothing but innuendo. But luckily we can check, because the site provides the details of every person they're counting towards their total, which is admirable transparency, presuming that what it tells us is relevant and accurate. Slightly less impressed that it tells you to repeat to yourself after every line: the COVID vaccine is a normal vaccine. The COVID vaccine is safe. These injuries and deaths are normal. I mean, that's just manipulative use of suggestion. But okay, let's look at the first few on the list. Let's look at the first 10. Ben Steele, American footballer, diagnosed with cancer. Wait, what? Why is a cancer diagnosis listed here? According to the news story, Mr. Steele is beginning treatment for lymphoblastic lymphoma. That is described online as a fast-growing, aggressive type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, NHL. Lymphoblastic lymphomas are most common in adolescents and younger adults, it says. Now, there's no evidence I've seen anywhere to suggest that a vaccine can give you cancer. I mean, I did a quick sanity check, a search on Google Scholar on vaccine side effects cancer, and all I got were the search for a vaccine for cancer and issues for existing cancer patients with different vaccines. Bear in mind, the suggestion's not only that the vaccine can give you such a cancer, it's that it could develop really quickly after you got vaccinated. Indeed, for it to have reached this stage where he's having to go into chemo, I mean, it must have begun developing before he even had a vaccine at all, you would think. So this is not exactly a great sign. That's the very first one on the list. But let's keep going. Number 2, unnamed 51-year-old triathlon competitor. Okay, but I thought the list was about young athletes. 51-year-old dies in triathlon. It's a personal tragedy. We might certainly posit that that's still too young to die. It's not entirely as surprising as under 35-year-olds dying. So far with our first two, I'm also seeing no confirmation of vaccination status or any kind of serious link there. Owen Shiel, 17-year-old quarterback American footballer, died of cancer again. He had leukemia. Okay, this one looks more likely. Gabriel Manganiello, 27-year-old rugby union player, forced to retire from playing due to heart problems. Thankfully, not deceased. No indication of a connection to vaccination, very much though in the line with the pattern identified in those previous studies. Pietro Tuziano, 26, footballer, died of leukemia again. Now wait, this one is just crazy. Simiso Buthelezi, 24-year-old boxer, collapsed near the end of a match, diagnosed with internal bleeding on the brain. A boxer. Near the end of a boxing match. How could that bleeding on the brain have possibly come about? Must have been the vaccine. Mendu Srivanas, 48 years old, an Indian cricket player and journalist, died after experiencing chest pains. Again, 48, not under 35. Antonio Velasco, age 61, runner collapsed from cardiac arrest while running in a half marathon. It's tragic, but not an astonishing outcome for someone age 61 running a marathon. Unnamed motorcyclist, not an athlete I would suggest, died after feeling unwell. So wait, man unknown died at age unknown of cause unknown. Relevance to the vaccine? Unknown. Number 10, Danielle Kang, 29, professional golfer, diagnosed with a tumour on her spine. Not yet confirmed whether it's malignant or benign. And what? Now that's supposed to have been caused by the vaccine now? So you can get cancer tumours all over the place and they all come from the vaccine? I started scanning the list looking for entries that looked like they might actually qualify. Now Conor McGough looked possible, American footballer suffering from myocarditis after vaccination. So at least a specific reference to vaccination status. Except that when I looked at his case, it just isn't true. This article about his retirement quoted him tweeting, "In August of 2020, I began to treat my heart for myocarditis. Myocarditis is a heart disorder where the heart becomes inflamed due to a viral infection. August 2020 predates for vaccines, predates from being available for anyone, let alone someone aged 26. And his situation, he reported, got worse after he caught COVID." So look, that's the first 10. And it seems as though they are representative of the whole list. Only one of those fulfilled the criteria, a young athlete suffering from cardiac issues, and since he survived, then none of those 10 would have appeared in the statistics that the headline number was being compared to. Let me remind you, that paper we looked at, the sample was restricted to active athletes in competitive sport under the age of 35 with sudden death associated with cardiac problems and no other clinical explanation. Obviously, the numbers you get from that selection are going to be considerably smaller than the one where you throw in cancers, random people who died on motorcycles of causes unknown, etc. and etc. Therefore, you have no evidence. You're pointing at a phenomenon that has seen any growth at all in recent years, because we have no studies with that loosely defined sample group that you could conceivably compare it with. I must admit, when I started looking at the list, I was expecting a rather higher percentage of actual fair comment cases than that. I thought this would be a more detailed and complex piece of research with statistical anomalies that you have to go into and all of that. It's truly breathtaking. They are just posting those. No wonder the website owners choose to remain anonymous. And you should be curious to know why they are running this site. I mean, if it was just American right-wing politicos, they tend to proudly own their positions. So someone doesn't want to do that. And they know that for a lot of people, the introduction of doubt is enough to make them scared of something like a vaccine, even when supported by patently ridiculous information. It's like how psychologists have shown that if you ask one to let you do something like cut in front of them in line, if you add to your request because and then a supposed reason, however transparently bogus the reason is, you get a much higher degree of compliance. This website seems based on the same principle. The content is patently absurd, but the headline with all that detailed supporting information still produces doubt in a number of people's minds, gets them quoting the headline figures. Presumably many of them would notice all the detailed cases and just take it as read that they must be legit and not bother to look at the detail. You might then wonder, how can a physician such as Pierre Kory end up referring to that site as a form of evidence for anything? Because he should know better.
With something like 780 deaths of young, healthy footballers and other athletes from around the world in 2021.
I can't consider anyone who would do so as a reliable narrator in any discussion including scientific expertise. Now, none of that's going to make any difference to the true believers, of course. They'll find ways to excuse the nonsense. But for those of us that believe in solid arguments supported by evidence, that is a clear strike. Those arguing that there's major levels of vaccine harm are going to have to point at something with a lot more credibility behind it to even get a first look from me in the future. By the way, if you have an appetite for a rather stronger set of for and against arguments than we discovered this time, I did a video recently reviewing the evidence we now have on whether the policies of lockdown were justified or not for the recent pandemic. There's a lot more grey areas in that question, which makes it both important and interesting. If you've made it this far, maybe watch that video next.